If your black and white photos look tepid and washed out a bit like this one, but you want it to look more like this, well, don't worry, in this Luminar tutorial, I've got you covered. So in this video, let's see how we can take this color image and apply the best black and white conversion techniques to really bring out the most from this photo. So the first step is to make sure we're happy with our exposure, that our highlights aren't getting blown out, and that we have detail in the shadows as well. Ideally, we want to move the white slider so that the brightest part in the photo is just starting to touch white. And although at the time I'm recording this, we don't have access to a histogram inside of Luminar NEO, it's really not the end of the world, because as long as you're working on a calibrated monitor, you should be able to eyeball things pretty closely. So I know that this area here is the brightest part of the image. I can just see that, and I'm happy with where I've set that. And the same for the blacks. If I grab that slider, if we pull it all the way to the left, obviously that's too far because we're losing all of that detail in the shadows and just pushing things all the way to black. We don't want that. We want to make sure we have a full dynamic range during this first part of the edit to work with going forward. i.e. we have a full brightness range in our photo all the way from black all the way up to white. If we've got that, we're in a pretty good place. Let's have a look at our before and our after. And as I flick between the two, you can see that we've maximized that dynamic range and added just a little bit more contrast into the file. While I am mentioning contrast, curves is a great tool for controlling contrast. We could add an S curve to boost the contrast up. We can put an opposite curve in there to reduce the contrast. We have a lot of options, but I don't like to do that at this stage of the edit, but it makes much more sense in our processing journey to leave those curves adjustments to later in the post-production. Let's close that down, and while the color section is open here, let me just give you a demonstration of what we don't want to do. If I grab the saturation slider here and just bring that down, so we're removing all the color from the photo, we're left with a grayscale image, but it's just so milky and washed out. Here on this channel, we know we want more from our edits. So I'm going to double click that to reset it, and then I'll show you a much better way to convert your images to black and white. Adding sharpening to your photo is often a really important step. However, just like with the curves tool that I spoke about before, I don't recommend doing this during the early stages. If we were to go ahead and sharpen our image, and just for argument's sake, let's say I'm pretty uncouth with this and I push the radius all the way to 100, just for instructional purposes. But here's the thing, if we build this sharpening in at this early stage and then we apply a lot of Luminar's other great tools such as Accent AI, or let's say Structure AI as well, I've been really aggressive with these, pushing them to 100 just to demonstrate this point. You guys are probably aware that sharpening at its very core is looking for differences between adjacent pixels. And so if I zoom into 600%, you'll see it. And then what it does is increase the contrast between those adjacent pixels, hence this haloing effect. But the art of doing a good sharpen is to get the image looking nice and crisp, but without those halos. So if you introduce the sharpening too early in your process, as you add Luminar's other tools, you're only going to amplify that haloing effect. So I absolutely recommend save your sharpening till the end. Now this is some pretty extreme processing we've got going on here, so I am going to reset these, but just before I do, I just want to make you aware of all the dust spots that I have visible here, and that's because I was shooting at f16 and I am a dirty, dirty man. Look at my sensor, that absolutely needs a clean, that is disgusting. But one of the really amazing things with Luminar NEO is we have a tool to fix this. So first of all, I'm just going to reset these tools and throw them away, so no AI enhance, throw that in the bin as well. Make sure we come back to our sharpness and we want to take that all the way off. And I'm just going to jump into optics, and I always turn these options on. And in this latest update in Luminar NEO, we now have the ability to use this transform tool. I was downhill in this grassy bank here when I took this photo, and I'm having to tilt the camera up to capture the lighthouse. And without shooting it with a tilt shift lens, that is the optical reality that we have to deal with. But thankfully we have tools inside of Luminar NEO that are going to allow us to do that. So this vertical slider, as I move that around, you can see that we're actually moving our two-dimensional photo in a three-dimensional space, and we're actually able to correct. However, when you start transforming your photo in this way, things can start to get a little bit squashed, but thankfully we have this aspect slider here, which if we take it that way, things get even more squashed. But if we take it into the positive direction, we can get that lighthouse shape back to how it should be. Alright, a lot to take in there, and we haven't even got to black and white yet, but here we go. This is our before, this was our after. Before and after, and as I flick to our before and our after, I'm thinking that we may even just want to push that aspect just a little bit further, just to make sure that lighthouse has its correct proportions. Okay, let's jump back into our tools here, and I'm going to come up to the erase section, and I want to see what remove dust spots can do for us. And you guys saw just how many dust spots there were on this file. And if I zoom in here, you can just see a couple here. So I'm just going to click remove dust spots, and I'm pretty excited to see whether Luminar NEO can actually get rid of these. For the AI to analyze my 45 megapixel file, which it's just done now, it does take a little while. However, I would much sooner that Luminar NEO was doing those calculations for me than I was going in meticulously removing each and every one of those dust spots. Okay, that's much better, and now it's time for us to jump into the black and white conversion, and this is where all the magic happens. So the first thing we need to do is just simply click convert to black and white, and currently this doesn't really look much different from that desaturated version I showed you earlier. However, this is where things get interesting. We are able to control the brightness values of the individual colors that we have here using these sliders down here. So as you can see on the left hand side, we have a lot of blue in the sky. If I grab the blue slider and bring the luminance value of that down, and luminance is just referring to the brightness, you can see that we're able to directly talk into those blue pixels and darken them down. We can do the same with the yellows, so if we wanted just to control the highlight on the lighthouse here, we could do that, or if we want to brighten things up just a little bit, we could do that too. We've probably got some cyan in the sky as well, so yep, there you go, you can see that. We can drop that down, perhaps even some magenta as well. And now we have a black and white conversion that we've actually been in control of. But to get the most out of your black and white, there are still a lot of tools that we can utilize. And as I share these tools and techniques, hopefully you'll be able to take these on board and apply them to your own landscape photos or any other genre of photography that you want to turn into a more impactful black and white. In the last black and white video where we converted a portrait, I touched on a couple of key points that we need to keep in mind when we're doing a black and white edit. And the first is our eye will tend to go to the brightest part of a frame, and then after that our eye will look for areas of contrast. And if we keep those things in mind, it can really help us along with our editing journey. And so if we know that our eye goes to the brightest part of the frame, it makes sense that the key interest in our photo, in this case the lighthouse, is the brightest part in the photo. So a tool that can really help us with that is the vignette tool. That's going to allow us to darken down the edges and therefore bring our viewer's eye away from the edge of the frame and in towards the area we want them to look at. And one of the things I really love about Luminar rather than other editing programs is we can actually control where the center of the vignette is. So rather than being confined to the default of the center of the frame is the brightest, we could actually click on our lighthouse and say this is the area that we want to be the brightest. From there we can come in and refine the look of our vignette so it's just the way we want it. One of the most important sliders inside of the vignette tool is the feathering. Look, as we push that up to 100 from where it was at its default of 0, you can see that transition between the very dark pixels around the edge of the vignette towards that center bit where we don't have any effect of it, that is much better as we push that up. When we bring it down too low, that transition's just too hard. So I would absolutely recommend pushing that pretty high, and I normally go all the way to 100. And because our amount is so strong, it's much easier to see the changes that these sliders are actually making. And so we can adjust our vignette to get it just the way we want it, and then we can come back to the amount slider and just ease it off. So if I double click that to reset it, so that's none of the effect, that's 100%, and now we can just wiggle this left and right and just start to visually gauge where we want this vignette to settle. And I found when we're working with black and white imagery, you can normally go quite a lot stronger with the amount than you can when you're working with color photos. Okay, let's close that down and have a quick look where we've come from and where we've got to. Here's our before, here's our after. Heading in the right direction, but I still think we can add a lot more punch to this image. So let's come up to one of Luminar's powerhouse tools, and that's Enhance AI, in particular Accent AI. Let's grab this and push it all the way to 100. Double click to reset it, and as I move it up to the right, I'm just letting my eye gauge the changes that it's making. And what I like to do as I'm moving this back and forth is just look around the photo and see if there's areas that I'm liking the effect, because more often than not, a tool like Accent AI is doing a great job, but I might not necessarily want to apply it to the whole frame. So for example, I really like what it's doing for the lighthouse here. It's really bringing out some interest, perhaps in some of the cloud as well, but I don't want to apply it through the whole image. And so what I'll do is come over, select my mask tool, And with the paintbrush selected and a strength somewhere around 1/3, and make sure I'm not on erase but on the actual paintbrush so we can positively paint this effect in, I can click and just paint over the lighthouse, and that's going to apply that effect with 1/3, and I can just keep clicking and painting over, and that's just going to build the accent AI effect up. If I want to put a little bit of it in the clouds, I can just do that. And I'm just finding the little hot spot above the lighthouse here is a little off-putting, so I'm going to get my erase tool, crank the strength quite high, and just take that away a little bit. And now we can look at our before and our after, before and after, and we're starting to add more contrast and interest to the area where we want people to look. A lot of Luminar's tools are great for adding contrast in your image, and a particular favorite of mine is Structure AI. So let's grab the amount slider and push that up. There, look at that. At a quick glance through our whole frame, things are looking a little bit ugly. If we look at our before and after, that's extreme, it's over the top. However, look down here on the grass. If we look at our before, we're getting close to losing all of that detail. Whereas if I apply the Structure AI down here, now we're getting a lot of that detail in the grass back. So before and after. And had we have neglected to bring back that detail in that initial develop raw process, the Structure AI tool wouldn't be bringing back any detail in the grass here because the detail just wouldn't be there to start with. But it is, so we can do a similar thing again and select the mask tool. I'm going to bring the strength back down, make sure I'm on my paintbrush here, and I'm going to click on the far right where the grass starts, and I'm just going to paint all the way across with my mouse and let go and look at our before and after. We're already bringing back some of that detail. We can make the brush a bit smaller so that we can do this in a little more refined way and not bleed over the edge of the grass there. And let's have a little toggle of our before and our after. There you go, we've got some detail back in the grass. If we want to add a small amount of Structure AI just into the lighthouse, not too much because it was being a little bit aggressive, we can just drop that strength down and just lightly paint over. And let's toggle that before and our after. And there you go, just another little layer of pop to the lighthouse. Let's take a look at another great tool for adding contrast in black and white images, and that is to come down here into the creative section and open up dramatic. Alright, let's grab the amount slider and start to bring that to the right. Pull it back down and just give that a little wiggle, see what it's doing, see what we like. Looking at areas of interest in our frame where we might want to apply this. And I definitely recommend this technique of just pushing the amount all the way to 100 just so you get a feel for what the tool is actually doing. If you're just dabbling around in really small numbers here, you're not really getting a sense of what the tool is doing and what it's capable of. So even if you were to decide that you just wanted a very small amount, maybe like 5 or 6, by only moving it a small amount, it's actually very hard to get a sense of what the tool is actually doing. So I strongly recommend push it all the way to 100, and then once you know, okay, I see what it's doing, maybe I only want about 8, 9 of that. The same goes for working with the tool's refinements. So for example, the local contrast, if I push that to 100 or bring it all the way back down to 0, it's quite hard to see what that's doing while the amount is set so low. So push the amount all the way up, grab the local contrast slider, and now we can really see exactly what that is doing. And so now that's much easier to set that where we want it, and now we can come back and just push the amount of that we want. Just like before, we can come and paint our mask in. Let's push the strength slightly higher, grab my paintbrush, and as soon as I click, this effect is just going to disappear and I'll see what was there before. And now I'm able to just lightly paint in the effect just where I want it. So perhaps these streaks through here, as they kind of lead our eye towards the lighthouse. So I'm going to enhance those, maybe paint over the lighthouse again, and we'll toggle our eye so we can see our before and our after. Okay, let me scroll back up and I'm going to show you how we can apply another level of develop. And for me, this is one of the reasons that Luminar NEO has an edge over Luminar AI, and that is that we can reapply a tool multiple times. So now I can come back in and I can work on a second pass of the develop tool. That first one just being about setting the right foundations for our file, and now we can come in and use the tool more creatively. So for example, I could grab the smart contrast slider and add more contrast into the photo. Don't want to do that much, but maybe something like that. If I feel like the exposure was getting a little high, I can bring that down as well. Just control our highlights a little bit. And although I am wanting quite a dramatic look, like I could get if I dropped the shadows down, I'm just going to boost them up because as you can see, if I go all the way, we just start to get a little bit more detail and interest in the grass again. So I'm not going to go too heavy-handed with it, but I will just boost it up a little bit. And if you're someone who likes to have a slight colorization to your black and white photos, you might like this little tip. If we just jump into the temperature slider here, we could either push that ever so slightly to the right and give our image a bit of a sepia kind of look, or my preference, which is to take things to the left and just give our black and white a little bit of a cooler feel. It's at this point during our processing that I would recommend adding the sharpening. However, I wouldn't do it through the develop section. I'm going to close this down because I want to keep that a separate part of my edit, and instead I'm going to jump into the details section where we can apply sharpening right here. We have all the same controls available to us, but if we were to jump into our list of edits and we look at the list of tools that we've applied to create the edit up till this point, we can see that separating this out from an organizational point of view, I can clearly tell that this is my sharpening tool, distinct from this additional application of develop. Let me show you a couple of extra tools that are pretty useful when you're working with black and white. So if we jump back down into the creative section, playing around with glow is quite fun, so we can crank our amount up, which is far too much, but again we can get a sense of what it can do for us. So once you've got your contrast in a place that you're happy with, that's where you can come in and start playing with these more creative tools. Again, you can mask them in exactly where you want them to. Mystical is another one that's worth playing around with, because the very nature of this tool increases the contrast whilst also adding some softening similar to those glow effects. We can take the shadows down even further just to add more to that contrast, create a crunchier or a softer look to it. Whatever floats your boat. I'm going to put a little bit of mystical in because, as you guys know, I quite like this tool, but I'm just going to leave that somewhere around 20. Let's have a look at our before and our after with the mystical. Okay, my favorite bit, let's have a quick look at our before color version on a lean and our after. Here's our before, here's our after, hopefully a quite impactful black and white. Now I appreciate by no means is this a particularly refined edit, but hopefully through this black and white conversion tutorial, you guys have been able to learn a little bit more about how to get the most out of Luminar NEO's pretty impressive editing tools. Right now, YouTube's offering up that black and white portrait video that I put together. That's well worth checking out. But in the background, we see that original grayscale conversion, the wrong way to do a black and white simply by desaturating and taking away the color, and then the black and white photo that we've created with this process I've shared today. I really hope this has been helpful, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much.